Some raise to others, coming back at you with another live video, as I tend to do. And today I want to talk to you about levels of analysis. Now it seems like kind of like a nerdy subject, but it's a subject that is the fundamental basis for every conversation that you are going to have with every person you are going to have that conversation with. So what is a level of analysis? So in school, K through 12, you are in different grades, right? And at every grade, there's a level of analysis. At every grade, there's a level of analysis. So we'll use math as an example, right? When you're in the kindergarten, you learn how to count, okay? That's one level of mathematics, right? You got to learn the numbers. You got to learn how to know what 1 is, what 2 is, right? When you see them, and then you have to learn how to associate, okay, 3 means that there are 3 items and so on and so forth, right? That's a kindergarten level of analysis. But in the first grade, you move up in your level of analysis, right? You move up to addition and subtraction, right? And then in the third grade, you move to multiplication and division, right? By the time you get to the 5th grade, you're dealing with fractions, right? So each one of those grades is offering you a different level of analysis in the same subject, okay? I think when I graduated high school, I was taking trigonometry or some craziness like that, right? And I wanted to take calculus. Some of my classmates keep arguing we had calculus, but I know we didn't have calculus because I explicitly remember talking to my counselor saying I wanted to take calculus. But I did not. Nevertheless, the point is, at each grade was a different level of analysis in the subject of math. So, what does that mean then when you have these conversations, right? Like you especially for somebody like me, like I consider myself what you would call a Fidelity Manager, right? So I come on, I get up in the morning, I look at my Facebook page, I look at my posts, I look at your posts, I look at everybody's posts, and I see what people are saying, right? And when I go through, I try to look at the coherence of the subject, right? And in order to evaluate the coherence of the subject, I have to know the level of analysis of whoever the poster is, right? Because some people have a higher level of analysis than other people, and those people I am more likely to engage than people of a lower level of analysis, right? So if I took trigonometry in high school, then I'm probably not going to have a mathematical conversation with somebody who's just learning how to count numbers, right? I'm not going to be on Facebook with a 5-year-old arguing about mathematics, right? Because they aren't at the highest level of analysis, right? Now, the level of analysis is important, because there are people who will engage in a subject at a level, they will engage in a subject where the level of analysis is higher than their capacity, right? So they think, well, I know math. Why can't I talk about math? But you just know numbers. You just know 1, 2, 3. You know how to associate 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3. You know how to make those associations. But if I'm talking about, let's say, quantum mechanics, right? Like, you can't discuss quantum mechanics with an elementary level of analysis in mathematics. Now, this is very important, right? Because I always talk about, if you watch my posts, if you follow my page at all, I repeatedly post certain subjects because I want to keep things at the forefront of our minds. And one of the things I'm trying to keep at the forefront of our minds is I want you to look at the NAPE Scores, right? The NAPE Scores are the National Education Achievement Program or something like that, where it measures the proficiency rate or lack thereof of students in the American educational system, right? So you go every year, you take this test. I think you take it in the 8th grade, in the 12th grade, and the 3rd grade, or something like that, with different grades. And so they track you throughout your educational career to see intellectually where you are, right? So when you look at the scores of black people nationally now, there's going to be some areas where blacks are doing pretty good, and then there's going to be the rest of us. I'll say the rest of us. So what those math and science scores show you is our capacity to. I hate when somebody calls me when I'm in the middle of a video. So what those scores will show you is our capacity to engage in intellectual conversations, right? If people are not good in math and science, then they won't be able to make the necessary connections in other subject matters, right? So when we talk about, let's say, reparations, we always talk about reparations on my page. I'm always talking about reparations. And then I'll have somebody come out and say, black people need to do for self. Like, oh my God, right? Like, it's clear that this person is not mathematically equipped to understand the problem that exists before us. And then they'll start saying stuff like Black Wall Street, Black Wall Street 1920. Like, do you know what the income or the wealth gap was between blacks and whites in 1920 versus what the gap is today? Right? And understand, then we were closer in the gap, so our works mattered more. But now the gap is so much, you can't. It's like somebody trying to jump over a pothole on a skateboard. It's like somebody trying to jump over a pothole on a skateboard versus somebody trying to use that same skateboard to jump over the Grand Canyon. Like, if you don't know the size and the width of the gap, then you don't understand the tools that you knew to bridge that gap, right? To jump over a pothole, it just takes the proper amount of inertia, right? You move up enough speed, you click the back of the skateboard at the right time, and then you can jump over the pothole. But you can't use that same strategy to jump over the Grand Canyon. And right now we have a Grand Canyon level gap. So only reparations can work, right? Because reparations requires a larger infrastructure to build a bridge to close that gap. And so that's just one way where you talk about the level of analysis, where you can tell somebody's level of analysis. So if you're talking about reparations and the wealth gap, then you have to know, like, so, and I'm not telling you, like, this is not my opinion or perspective over the racial wealth gap. That's not my perspective, right? This is, like, you can do the research from William Sandy Darity. He's a professor at Duke University with a PhD from MIT in stratification economics, right? He's a stratification economist, right? So he studies the path of economics over time, right? So this guy, I mean, do you know, like, what it takes for you to get into MIT? And like most of these people, if they were the MIT graduate, they would be telling you about the economics in a different way than they telling you with their high school diploma. That when you look at the data will show you, like, we don't do good in math and science. Like, blacks generally don't do good in math and science. It don't mean that we don't have the capacity to do good. We don't have the context that support us to do good. And so I don't want to make this about reparations, but the point is that in the conversations, you have to be able to know what your level of analysis is, right? So I know when I'm talking to you, if we have an equal level of analysis. I know when somebody's level of analysis is beneath me, right? If you know algebra, you can tell that a person doesn't properly know how to do fractions, right? It don't mean you better than them. It just means that your level of analysis is higher than theirs. And so in these conversations that you have people who they've never read a book on the subject. They've never listened to a lecture. They don't have the resources. They don't have the intellectual resources to engage you in the conversation, but they'll do it anyway. And so what they do is they slow the conversation down, right? Because they come with the same level of passion that you have, but you are more skilled and equipped to dialogue in the conversation. I see you, Mike. And so a lot of people don't understand that. And so even for me, like, I have to know, like, what's the level of analysis for this person who's having a conversation with me? So when I'm talking with a person who has a PhD, my conversation with them has to be a little bit different than a person who has a high school diploma where they weren't proficient in any of the subjects. They weren't proficient in math. They weren't proficient in science, right? Like, this person can barely think, right? And so when I post those pictures that show you where we are and our capacity to intellectually have the appropriate conversations, whether it be about relationships, whether it be about conversations about relationships, whether it be conversations about economics, like, whatever the subject is, it doesn't even really matter the subject. If a person does not have the capacity for the subject, you'll find yourself as a student of algebra having a conversation with a person who's fundamentally at a kindergarten or first grade or even a third grade. Like third grade is basic math, right? Addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. That's basic math. And so trying to have a conversation with somebody about economics that only have a basic level of mathematical comprehension is gonna create a problem in that dialogue. And you can see, and they're gonna start talking about you and how you think you better than them, and that's not really the case. Like, this person does not have the humility to admit that the level of this conversation is above their level of analysis. It's above their level of analysis. And so that's what you want to look for when you're having dialogues. And sometimes I get into these conversations with people on social media more specifically, because I don't really hang out with people like that. I would like to. I probably, when this is all over, I'm probably try to find some groups or create a group of thinking people, right? But what those people should do is, right, let's say I have one of my Facebook friends. He's very smart. His name is Tavon. He's very smart, right? So I figure that we're at a similar level of analysis. I don't know for sure. I don't know what his IQ is. I don't know exactly what my IQ is, but I can tell in our dialogues that the conversation moves so smooth because we both have read some of the same subjects. We both know some of the same scholars, right? And understand, to know a scholar, you have to be at a scholarly level. So if you want to know what your IQ is, if you can have a dialogue with a person with a PhD, it means you have a PhD capacity. You may not have a PhD degree, but you have, in order to, let's say like Jordan Peterson, right? If you understand Jordan Peterson, it means that your understanding of him puts you at his level of intelligence. Some people, they can't understand what he's talking about. And so they'll create, he's a racist. And that may or may not be true, but that it doesn't correlate into the content itself, right? And so people start playing these games or doing this manipulation when the level of analysis is higher than they can comprehend. When it's higher than they can comprehend, you can see intellectually where they start to break down, where the conversation starts to become infantile, right? They start throwing slurs and childish comments at you, right? Because the level of analysis for the conversation is too high for them, and they don't have the humility to say that. Right. And so for me, I know when I'm talking to somebody who has a higher level of analysis than myself, and at that point, it's time for me to listen and take in information and try to get their resources, the intellectual resources that they had to draw the conclusion that they have, so I can be where they are as we are in the conversation. And so that, and I'm using that, but again, I just use each one of these sections to explain to you that you can be in a relationship with somebody whose level of analysis is not where your level of analysis is. And man, that is a difficult relationship to be in. It is a difficult relationship to be in. And so when you see, when you having, I've been in relationships where people would say stuff like, you think you know everything. Well, at that point, I'm done, right? Like, we can't even conversate anymore, because anything that I add to the conversation that you don't like or you don't value, you can just say, I think I know everything. But what it is it's giving me an archetype where you have essentially surrendered your intelligence. You have surrendered your intelligence, not mine, right? Because I don't compromise my intelligence for anybody. Whatever I know, I'm moving in that direction. I'm moving in that direction. And if you, so I'll close with this. So a lot of times my topics are data based. Even if I don't present the data, I've already done the research on the data, right? And it's not my data. And I try to tell everybody, and then people say, well, you can't trust data, and data can be misrepresented. And all of that is true. But the one thing you cannot do is you cannot put your opinion up against the data, even if the data is wrong, right? Because the data may be wrong, but we have a methodology which allows us to correct the wrong in the data. But we can't correct your opinion because it's your opinion, right? And you tend not to have the humility to say, oh, well, I don't know enough about that. I don't know enough about that, right? You don't have that. You don't have the tendency to do that. And so, so you have to be mindful of that when you're having these conversations with people, when you're having these conversations with your mate, when you're having these conversations with your kids. Sometimes you're having a conversation with your kids and you think that their level of analysis is where you are, and so you're getting frustrated. But the reality is, and I'll say this and then I'll close. Ideas, so I'm going to try to break this down. I learned this maybe, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Imam Fahim Shuaib taught me this. He said, words act as containers for ideas, right? So when you look at a word, let me see, I have a word on here. The word sheep, right? When I look at the word sheep, first thing I have to do is be able to read it, right? SHEEP, right? Each letter is a single individual letter, and each letter has its own sound. So when you put those sounds together, then you have the word. You have the word sheep. So now I have to be able to connect to what a sheep is, right? What does this word apply to? What is the idea that these letters put together are holding, right? So now you have the word sheep. You can connect it to the animal sheep, right? But all of that is a structure. And without that structure, we can't communicate, because it can't be that I call it a sheep and you call it something else, right? Even if it's in a different language, it's still the same idea. The idea doesn't change because the word changed, because what the word carries is the idea, right? And so ideas then have value structures. They have value structures, meaning if I'm going to teach you how to be in a relationship, well, there's a whole system that comes into understanding what that means. And so you may have somebody who have experience in relationships, but don't know what the structure of a relationship is, right? And so when they try to give you advice, they will leave out some fundamental aspects of the structure of relationships because they don't know. They don't know about the value structure of the concept of what a relationship is, right? And so, okay, I'll say this and then I'll close out. And this is why I have a problem. Excuse my language, please. So if you have kids around, if you don't mind them hearing me, I can do it without cussing. So if you have, one of the things religion is, and people crap on religion all the time. So I wasn't going to say crap. You can just imagine what I was going to say instead of crap. And plus I'm fasting, so I shouldn't be saying that anyway. When people crap on religion, they don't understand that they are crapping on structures, right? And when you blow out structures and you don't have another structure that's built foundationally to uphold the entire community, the entire civilization, the entire society, right? Society is undergirded by religious structures. You take those structures out, and this is what Nietzsche talked about, right? Where we have killed God, right? And how much were we going to find the water to wash away all the blood of the murderer of all murderers? Meaning, if you blow out these structures, complete chaos will exist. And so people sometimes, I'm talking about a subject and they talking about an individual thing, and I'm talking about an entire structure that is built up, preferably. And I'll use this last example. So people sometimes want me to have relationships that don't have structure. They want me to have relationships that don't have structure. And I don't believe in relationships without structure. Relationships without structures are chaos. And in scripture, in the Bible, it says God is not a God of chaos and disorder. He's not a God of chaos and disorder. And people are goading me and trying to pressure me and push me into these chaotic relationships with folks. And I'm not into it. It's either going to be in the structure that undergirds the society, or I don't want no part of it.